So, all the bad news, right? But what are we actually doing about it? We already talked about IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we mentioned the earlier meeting in Kyoto that came up with the Kyoto Protocol, where the countries were divided into Annex 1, Annex 2, and so on, where rich countries were expected to do more, and the developing world was allowed to be more deliberate in balancing their economic growth requirements and their need to reduce emissions and so on and so forth. Basically, the long story short, Kyoto Protocol was essentially a failure. Many countries didn't sign it, including countries like US, Australia, Canada, I think Russia, and so on. But there are complicated stories as well, like Japan, which was climate friendly, became spooked after the tsunami damaged the Fukushima power plant, and they went back from nuclear to coal. And they said forget climate change, even though there is some evidence that they were already dilly-dallying about that and so on. So climate change is riding on top of all these other issues which are quickly able to take priority, like COVID, for example. Economic recession can put away climate action unless climate action is beneficial to economic growth, and so on, right? So it was an international agreement among 60 nations. It was agreed to voluntarily limit greenhouse gases, even if gas emissions stabilize. We know already talked about committed warming because of the long life cycle of CO2 in the atmosphere. And human environment was obviously is altering the human activities are obviously altering the environment. The question is how bad and how irreversibly, right? So Kyoto Protocol officially ended in 2012 or so, and then new negotiations started. 2015, the so-called Paris Agreement came about, and the main difference was that Kyoto Protocol was seen as somewhat of a top-down system, which nobody likes, especially some countries which don't like their governments. So Paris Agreement tried to be more democratic, so they created what was called intended nationally determined contribution. Each country was asked to submit a plan to say how quickly they will move away from emitting so much carbon dioxide. So then more recently intended was dropped, and now they're just called nationally determined contributions. And in 2016 some steps were made. The new IPCC publication came out on how half a degree increase in our agreed upon target of 2 degrees. So what would be the difference if we limited the warming, global mean temperature rise with a certain probability by 2100 from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. A lot of things were shown by scientific synthesis that even a half degree warming can be much worse for many environmental systems, ecosystems, oceans, forests, and so on. So verification phase is going to come along, and so on. So there are steps codified into the negotiations, into the Paris Agreement. So many countries like European Union, United States of America, Russia, Canada have submitted plans, whether they will do things like CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, whether they have policies for it, what are their ambitions to reduce their CO2 emissions by 40% with respect to a baseline of 2005, or less here, and so on and so forth. So I won't go through everything, but you can see that there are many. So baseline emission here is used differently by different. European Union went back to 1990, whereas United States said they will only go back to 2005. Why does it matter? Because the CO2 levels in 1990 were much lower. So if you choose a higher baseline, then you are reducing less with with respect to that new higher baseline, and so on. Okay, 2050 ambitions, international carbon credits, which means if you emit less carbon, you can sell your credit to somebody who is emitting more carbon. So there is a trading of carbon credits. Kind of complicated calculations, but nonetheless they are part of the agreements. The gases considered: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, PFCs, SF6, NF3, and so on. And nationally determined contributions, where do I want to go with it? Let's say I want to jump to, whoops, India and China are not here. So India, for example, has promised to reduce its carbon emissions GDP, carbon intensity of its GDP with respect to 2005 by 25 to 30%, I think, by 2030. Okay, the wording is complicated. They are not going to reduce absolute amounts of CO2 emission. They are going to reduce the carbon intensity of their GDP. So GDP they want to keep increasing, so CO2 emission will increase, but each unit of rise in GDP will be produced by emitting less carbon. Okay, how will that be done? By basically increasing renewable energy sources, and by creating additional carbon sinks of, let's say, 2.5 to 3 gigatons of carbon by more forest area, by increasing forest area and making the deforestation less, and so on. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense that global human is busy trying to pay attention to the problem, trying to solve the problem. Many complicated negotiations happen. Many concessions have to be made. For example, if rich countries have already become very rich by emitting all this carbon that has accumulated in the atmosphere, can they really restrict countries like India, Brazil, China, Mexico, or whoever else, East Europe, from becoming richer by also burning more carbon? Right? So you can look at the environmental footprint versus GDP. High GDP is always got higher environmental footprint, which means GDP growth always comes from destroying the environment. I don't know if destroying is the right word, but let's say degrading the environment. Can we move to a higher GDP without doing that? Can we go to a higher GDP without increasing carbon emissions? Everybody wants to do that. Renewable energy is one, efficiency is one, and we'll look at what individuals can do and what there are some of the private citizen organizations are trying to do.